obviously, I want to start by thanking the organizers of Moy's to have us here and to have these kinds of conversations. Today, I in particular want to thank Beza because this conversation really comes from a conversation that she and I had early on in thinking through what are some of the issues and questions that we have around the conversation about art and technology and media and new media and digital art and so on and so forth. And we sort of came up with this question of when is media art avant-garde? In part because it seems as if the phrase avant-garde gets used so frequently in relationship to arts using technology. And it's sort of implicitly meant to be a good thing. But the phrase doesn't seem to clearly have any specific meaning or and is being used in this way. And so it sort of seemed like it might be useful just to think through in the context of the fact that one of the advantages of being in a fair like this and in this context is that whereas a lot of time we wind up having to defend these arts practices and explain the use of these technologies, we can, on some level, presume that all of us here today, essentially, we believe in this practice. We believe in the work that's being done by artists today and being shown by galleries and at art fairs that's being collected. And so that gives us an opportunity to actually challenge some of our own presuppositions by being in conversation with each other and to sort of question, where are we coming from? Why are we using this phrase? What do we mean by that? In hopes of being able to clarify our own positions, even if they remain different from each other's. So part of that was the idea that we could have a conversation as an artist and a gallerist and a critic and theorist about what are we talking about? And so just to kind of get us started, I wanted to sort of put out there, since we've all heard this thing of this invocation of avant-garde, but I at least don't typically stop someone and be like, what do you mean by avant-garde? Right? I sort of assume I kind of know. What is it, and maybe I'll start with you, Kevin, when someone says to you, like, this is really avant-garde, what do you interpret that they're trying to say?
Well, unfortunately, I think they are saying what they're trying to say, and I think that it's not always accurate. I think there's a tendency to characterize early adopters of technology as being avant-garde just for the sake that they were the first to use this tool or another tool without any other supporting context or raison d'être to employ this work. I mean, for me, it should mean sort of creating work of novel nature, innovative nature that reflects some socio-political dilemma or advances a conversation, discourse around politics, society, pushing against tradition and classicism.
Yeah. Okay. Well, how have you encountered, like, when people come to you saying, this is really avant-garde, I want you to look at it, or I'm looking for something like that. What is it that you think people are trying to invoke?
I think it depends on who is in front of you. I think there are many people who are knowledgeable, and usually the collectors, they are knowledgeable. Sometimes they're even smarter than many gallerists, very well educated, but majority of if you encountered the fairs, like a public, people are confused and they're like, they can use the terminology of avant-garde when they're looking at something, when they don't understand something, when they think like, okay, probably this is too much for me, and then they use this term avant-garde, or something like is probably too progressive, radical. And if they mean by radical and progressive or revolutionary, that means that they do actually understand the term because it's meant to be like that. But if it's only just because it's too much for me, it disturbs me, I don't understand it, then it's a different meaning. And I think there is a misconception of avant-garde. I think maybe mostly coming from French, because like avant means like forefront, in front of you. And without knowing where this terminology comes from, many would mistake probably saying that it's probably something, forward thinking in the future. But it actually doesn't come from that. It comes from the military term, and this is what is important when we use this terminology, I think, because majority of artists using new cutting edge tools, they are at the front fighting to prove that this is the artistic tools that they wish to express themselves with. And this is not necessarily a journey which is easy for the artists to be there as pioneers using different technologies or innovative ways of expressing themselves to create and exhibit their work. And this is this is how I understand it. Something novel, pioneering, not necessarily using only technology.
Yeah, the military term is partly about sending out a group to do reconnaissance, right? To do reconnaissance on the other side and bring back information that will then be useful for whatever the military action will then be. And so it's interesting to think through that notion of, in the context of technologies, using these innovative or emergent technologies to figure out what they are and sort of bring back information to the wider population about it. Of course, that's actually, that's the military term, but its use across art and how it's been adopted across our history is quite complicated. I wonder if maybe now I'll just do a little history of the. Yeah. So, excuse me, I'll put on my little scholarly hat here for a moment. The term avant-garde seems to first appear in relationship to art in about 1825, and there's some dispute about who was the person who used it first, because there's two articles that come out by people who are associated. And the idea is that the artist should be at the vanguard, and uses the term avant-garde specifically to suggest a kind of radical social reform that's being considered in this period, in the sort of post-revolutionary period of Europe, and specifically in France, where these essays come out. An example of that winds up sort of being, if I may, for a moment, Turner's 1840 slave ship, for example, right? And this realism, the period of art known as realism, where the idea was that art could itself present the ideas and the social reform that then society would be able to enact. So in this famous painting, otherwise titled Slavers Throwing Overboard the Dead and Dying, the idea was to really bring to light some of the issues around slavery, even in nations that no longer had slavery, but were a part of the economic market around it, and to sort of support the abolitionist movement, right? So that's how you sort of get this notion of the radical social reform. What happens in that period, though, is this way in which art starts to become autonomous. And it needs to do that if it's going to be a radical reform agent, because it needs to be able to have agency and to be independent and to be able to speak and do in society. So the autonomy of art becomes a part of the conversation in theory and so forth across this period. So that by the end of the 19th century, what we're seeing with the decadence and the art for art's sake movement is the complete autonomy of art. So that art has become totally separate from society and from politics. And that is then what, in part, the modernists, and I'm going to come back to the split in the modernists in a moment, we wind up wanting to disagree with, is this way in which art has become so separate from society and can no longer be a part of the society. And how do we bring art back into it? And there's a couple things going on here. One has to do with the fact that if art is completely separate, culture, so to speak, is over here, and society is over there. Anything that is the speculation, the imagination, the semblance that gets produced over here in society winds up getting relegated over there into culture. And so art winds up always sort of taking away any of the imaginative potential of society. So we need to bring imagination back into the society and to have it become extensive within society. So that's where you sort of see with some of the way the notion around Dada and the surrealists, the futurists, and some of the Russian avant-garde get perceived. Fast forward into post-World War II, Hermann Greenberg winds up positing a different notion of avant-garde. He posits the Impressionists and Cubists, and of course, abstract expressionism as being avant-garde. And what he's doing there is different from the sort of socio-political act, but is trying to position avant-garde as being a formalist activity, where what's happening is a new form is being produced in the art. And so it's in this that we then find ourselves at the very beginning of contemporary art with a sort of anxiety and debate happening around what does it mean to be avant-garde? Is it a formalist thing? Are you producing new forms? Or is it this radical social act? You then get into a whole bunch of highly theoretical debates, basically between these sort of Greenbergians and post-structuralism and Frankfurt School. And I'm going to kind of skip through their debates around avant-garde and postmodernism. But that's going on essentially in the 80s. That winds up sort of positioning this idea of avant-garde as having to both be formally, but also trying to respond no longer to art as an institution, which the 1920s avant-garde was seeing art as being an institution that needed to stop being an institution and become a cross-life, but seeing that the institutions surrounding art need to be radically rethought. And so you get the institutional critique. So all that's happening in what we'll call mainstream contemporary art. And at that same moment, of course, we're having the rise of computer art, and in the 1990s, net art and software art. And this is kind of where I want to get us to, because there's an very important, I think, an important essay in 2002 written by Lev Minovich, Software as Avant-Garde. And in that essay, he's positing the way in which the use of software is revisiting the 1920s Russian avant-garde, but isn't just replicating them. The same way that those artists were using communication technologies, I will be double-minded. The same way they were using communication technologies to introduce art into the general sphere, now these artists, these software artists and net artists, are using communication technologies. But they are altering them. And I can go into some detail about that at some point. But what I wanted to sort of bring forward is this way in which, because of this moment where software art gets interpreted as being avant-garde, because it's a new form, because of the way it's altering this earlier avant-garde moment, what winds up becoming, and I guess I will sort of mention here, it's the way in which, for example, collage of the Russian avant-garde becomes cut and paste, right? The way montage becomes the ability to have multiple windows happening at once. And that is what they are presenting as no longer about taking objects that exist and presenting them throughout, but the way in which you access information and showcasing new models of accessing and distributing information. And it kind of leaves us in some ways with the way we still think of so much art using technology as presenting the new ways communication can move, the new ways that information is being distributed. And that sort of very, very rapid move through, and I apologize for that, but that made me think about, if avant-garde has had such a fluid movement where it's sometimes political and sometimes formal and sometimes about, picking things up from the past and sometimes a complete break from the past, if we allow the phrase to be something positive, right? What might avant-garde be today in 2023? Some 20 years after Minovich wrote that essay. Because what he posited then isn't new anymore for us. We know about the way information is being distributed. We are all doing it all the time. It has itself become the status quo, right? So, as an artist, as a gallerist, and this is totally speculative, and I'm not going to hold you accountable for any of the things you try out here today, but just to sort of get us, but to get us just thinking about what this might be, what might be avant-garde today as a practitioner?
I think it is very difficult to contemporaneously even assess what the avant-garde is. I have a feeling it becomes clearer over time. And the first thing I wonder is the necessity to even identify the avant-garde. Is there a need to identify the avant-garde? And I would say yes, for the sake of understanding better art and culture, the evolution of art and culture. But for instance, I think we've established it's not enough to be an early adopter of, say, AI or the latest flavor of AI, and yet perhaps there's a take on how society is impacted by this technology, but presented in a novel fashion through the utilization of the tool. But I'm fairly convinced that time must pass before we can identify an artist as having been avant-garde. I'm not sure. I'm not certain that one could say that this artist is avant-garde. I think it may be only in the past tense.
But Kate, I would think as a gallerist, as you're looking at art and thinking about what you want to show in your gallery, that on some hand, you are thinking that very question. Like, you want to be able to present some of what you think is the best work being produced at this time, especially in the context of generative art. Maybe I'm wrong, but how would you think about avant-garde?
To be honest with you, I never look at the art when I try, or let's say plan to exhibit something from the perspective of what is the best art or what is potentially can be avant-garde. And I think here you mean it as provocative. I always look at it from the perspective what can interest me personally and what is novel about the art that I'm looking at. And to be honest with you, if we are talking only about the AI generative art scene, it's becoming a bit repetitive and frustrating for me as a gallerist and as a collector to look at the works and find something that excites me personally. So I usually work with artists and exhibit artists that personally I find novel, interesting, innovative, pioneering, something that I haven't seen before, tools that they've been using because I know what kind of systems they were building, or if there is a new algorithm that they were exploring, or is there any social political dilemma that they're exploring, or some issues that they're trying to challenge the public with. There should be something, either conceptually or technologically or even aesthetically, something that catches the attention and saying, okay, I haven't seen that. Because if you go around, you go to Art Basel, you go to all the fairs, contemporary art fairs, and it repeats itself on the annual basis, unfortunately. And then you are like, okay, what is contemporary about that? And I don't want to show that contemporary in the gallery. I want to really try to demonstrate the sort of zeitgeist about our time, because contemporary is literally a reflection. And I think avant-garde, if you look at the normal classical definition, it is a reflection of the reality as well, like how the artists were seeing the reality back at the time, and using different tools to to present how they disagree or agree or try to change the world around them, and also probably democratize art in a sort of way where the artist has a power to create and paint even, like, I don't know, Turner was painting the train as a symbol of a movement, that was not possible before in academic schools. Or if we look at the suprematists, they're using completely different type of expression, again, to talk revolution, to talk about the change, to talk about the disagreement, political disagreement. And also we see like the development of different type of movements, arte povera and et cetera, post-war, where again, we're not only talking about media, but we're talking about something that really catches the time.
I was just going to say, all three of us have talked a lot about novelty, and I just can't help but wonder if in a time when everyone's competing for attention, artists are competing for attention, if one can't engineer novelty, and if that's happening, and I would posit that it is, how does one parse that? Like, are you able to
isn't novelty exhausting at this point, right? I mean, I think part of it is we're constantly being inundated with novelty. That is so much the point of the social media, of the various different products that are constantly being given to us. The fact that we constantly have to update the various devices that we have with the latest and best, newest, so forth, right? Novelty itself
is no longer novel.
Right? And so in that context, what's sort of interesting, I mean, I don't know where you're going to go with that, but like the first thought that I have is maybe then the technology, it's not about showcasing the fancy doodads of what a technology can do.
Right.
Right? It might be about something else. Just to sort of clarify, there's these sort of two situations that the avant-garde winds up finding itself. One is a radical restructuring of society. It is a revolutionary movement, right? The idea is society needs to be completely altered. That is a part of that sort of that 20s moment. And then there's the avant-garde that gets reinterpreted in the 80s. That is the idea that what the avant-garde does is tell us about the world that we're living in, right? And so just to sort of make sure that we're clear on those kind of two facets, because we often treat art and technology like it should tell us about the world and these devices and these objects. But is that useful anymore?
How many people get let into the avant-garde club? Like, is there a cutoff after 5 artists?
I mean, lots of people wind up this is one of the things, the reason I sort of wanted to walk through this sort of art historical lineage was to point out the way in which different theorists posit different groups, right? So you have one set of people who would never say that, Courbet or Manet are avant-garde. No, unconditionally not. It's, Malevich and it's Duchamp who are avant-garde. So,
and who is it important to besides art historians?
Well, I mean, I don't know whether the reason it seems like it's important is because people keep invoking it.
Gallerists like it because it's a potential marketing position.
Okay.
This artist is avant-garde.
Yeah.
They're somehow more significant than others.
And some of the tech companies and some of the tech companies like it for the same reason. We have the most avant-garde artist who is doing a residency at our company, or we have the most, right? You hear it there too.
Yeah.
But I guess one of the things it sort of struck me, and I think you're getting at, Kevin, is like, is the job of media art, by which I'm going to just like broad spectrum. Bernard just did a good job in the previous panel of sort of talking about all art is media art. But is it necessary anymore to present novelty? Isn't that actually what we're exhausted by?
It's banal. Novelty is banal. It's, yeah.
So then what is it that we might want of media art today, if it's not necessarily about using the latest technologies?
I think it's about power. I think it's about power. It's a shift of power. And I think with particularly last 10 years, with the introduction of new technologies, and everybody hates NFTs or the terminology of NFTs.
Not all of us.
It was revolutionary, interesting in terms of how it went into the mass market and how the power shifted towards the creatives and towards the artists. And I think it was a similar shift from the back in the history where the artists got the freedom of expression and kind of could separate a little bit from the academics and could paint and could create and reflect on how they feel and how they want to communicate with the audience their work and what they want to what kind of questions they wish to answer with their work or question further. Like, I don't know, good example would be maybe Hannah Kirch, the German Dada artist, you know, who was pioneering with a collage and Dada sort of, you know, photography collages, addressing the gender equalities. And back at the time, you know, and that was a social political questions that she was addressing with absolutely different tools, and it was very avant-garde back at the time. And even now, if you look at it, it's still very burning sort of questions that she's asking, and very similar ones. And with NFTs and with the blockchain and like, you know, toward like the shift that you can give power to through your work. I think this is what can avant-garde be.
Yeah, so you make a great point. So blockchain technology, the implicit promise was democratization of power, redistribution of power.
Sorry to interrupt you, but that was the same message back in 19th century, trying to democratize also in the perspective of the history, what was going politically. There was a shift. Power was given to the people, not to the government.
So this is the implicit promise and perhaps the intention. But then years later, can we demonstrate this effectively? I would suggest maybe not. I can look at has it empowered artists? Perhaps some. But I don't think it's moved the needle to a great extent.
Not yet.
Not yet. So that's a great example. So in 2013, when I was working with the blockchain, or 2018, where it started to pick up steam, you know, could the cohort of artists working with these tools with intention be considered avant-garde, or must we wait until today, or another 10 years, or 20 years, or 30 years to fully assess how impactful this work was? And is it enough for an artist to be avant-garde with intention, or must this intention be proven out through effective impact on society?
I sort of like this idea of thinking about it in terms of power now, that maybe structures of power and acknowledging how power is maintained, controlled, and or potentially shared is maybe an avant-garde space to be right now, because power is such a striking issue around the world. it seemed clear to me in some ways that the issues around blockchain and like the distribution of power and its attempts to it. And I would argue that actually, in terms of art, that NFTs and blockchain compared to the rest of the NFT space or the crypto space actually did do some of that, right? Whereas in gaming and in finance, much more questionably distributed. But what about with these new public generators? So much gets said about the idea that it's like this shared resource. Everyone can go on, you can just use it.
There are barriers to entry.
Go ahead.
No, that's it.
So is there, I mean, and because you've been using it, I mean, basically extensively for years now. And so how
Some might even say my usage was avant-garde.
Ooh.
I wouldn't.
So how do you encounter power in using the generators, either your own or of the generator, the companies? How do you see power playing out there?
I see myself, first off, as at least in the context of, say, American society, as a privileged white male who has money to invest in my process. One of the barriers to entry is money, to be able to even create art on, say, Ethereum, or especially now on blockchain is even a greater barrier to entry on the Bitcoin blockchain. Just to give an example, I have a project coming out, 500 pieces. It cost me $31,000 to mint the work. This is not. Does not sound conducive to.
But you don't have to use cryptocurrency to use ChatGPT or.
Oh, sorry, all generators. Yeah. Well, you do need, if you want access to the more useful version, you've got to subscribe, and $40 a month for some people might as well be $31,000. So I think this promise of empowering the masses, the disenfranchised, the marginalized through technology is wonderful. And in some cases, we see some of this. But the statistic that always sticks in my head is in the United States, people who identify professionally as artists, it's a fraction of a percent that make more than $10,000 a year from their practice. That's what it always was. And this has not changed with blockchain. And sure, they'll put an African-American woman up front. They'll put people who have traditionally had a smaller chunk of the pie on a pedestal and say, look, see, there's a woman and she's making a fortune on the blockchain. But there are all these entities in the background that have a vested interest in the technology that artists are using, and we're sort of all pawns in this process. Like I have companies, I have wealthy individuals around the world contacting me regularly, begging me, offering to pay me to use their technology to make art.
Yeah, because art was always the best tool in order to test all the scientific innovations. And through the dialogue between the artist and the technology, you can actually get the best feedback also towards your product. So, and also the best advertising is literally through art.
Yeah.
Like the propaganda and, Russian avant-garde also, which
It strikes me, so we'll have to sort of, I didn't realize we have to wrap it up so that there's a chance for people to ask questions. But the question that we keep stumbling back into the idea of novelty, right? And I think it's a really interesting thing. I don't know if you like how we keep falling, all of us, falling back into it because of the way in which it's so tightly attached to this notion of what is valuable about art, especially, oddly, art using technology. And yet, one of the things that I have noted and we've all talked about is a bizarre dehistoricization that happens around art and technology. Just how frequently people forget the histories, it's not invoked, there isn't this relationship neither to the history of arts and computer arts, nor to the societies in which these artist projects were being developed or the politics of the time period, right? And so it also occurs to me that what might be oddly avant-garde is history, right? It's actually to remember history, to think about either older practices, older technologies, and the way in which those might also be able to introduce meaningful interjections into the insistence of novelty that is so much a trap in this conversation.
I'm sorry, I just, it made me think when you questioned Kevin about the power and about his work. I think the novelty and the way of how you can use the new technology to make it avant-garde is a good example by Kevin Abosh with editions, open editions, what you did, because it's sort of gameplay with a mass amount, like with a group, with a big group amount of people that were engaged into that, and you can, with the data and with this through the blockchain technology, you can communicate, you can control, you can play. There is a feedback loop and there is a lot of interaction. And this is what becomes very interesting, because through the new technology, without this technology, that would not be possible. And this is sort of live performance, which is also registered somehow. And I mean, it's some sort of a dialogue between the artist and the audience, which is infinite.
Yeah.
Right.
And a lot of presumptions we've had about art in the past, about its the state in which we might find it when we wake up in the morning, in the same place, in the same state. Some of this has been shattered, because now we have work that evolves over time, and it could take 50 years before we understand its impact and import.
Yeah, but also, does it give you a power as an artist to interact with this?
It can. It's a type of power.
Exactly. So this is also interesting,
And not all collectors want to even be part of this type of dynamic. It's too the unknown is a little bit unsettling.
Yeah. So I think, in this sense, this is some sort of avant-garde, at least to me, because, and I think, when we talk about the contemporary avant-garde as a term, I think the firstism is also very important, to be a pioneer, because whatever happens after it's been introduced is just a repetition. There is no novelty is missing, even if you're using the same technology and you're referring to the same ideas or to the history or anything. There is always somebody first who created it. So I think the firstism is very important as well when we talk about.
There's clearly some sort of value wrapped up in being first, because everybody is rushing to say, I was the first to this, I was the first one to stand on one leg and paint with my ear.
Or at least among the first ones.
But that seems to, but that's precisely my point, is that I think actually that might very specifically, there's no way you're going to get away from the economics of the first being valuable, because we're in a culture that has established that as being significant monetarily, historically, and so on and so forth. But I think it's interesting to consider that possibility that for culture, in the way that Bernard was speaking about in the previous panel, for the arts, novelty and to be the first might actually no longer be the most important practice. And what it might mean for all of us to start trying, it's very difficult, right? To try and start thinking about it in that way could actually potentially be really interesting and revolutionary. We have obviously not defined avant-garde here for you today, or what it should potentially be. But that wasn't the point of the conversation anyway. And so
I'd like to declare here in Istanbul, at Noise Istanbul, that we are entering the era of post-novelty.
But one of the things that we were doing before we got up here was sort of laughing about the fact that this is actually a joke. Like, we're a joke here right now. It's a critic, the gallerist, and an artist walk into a bar, right? And so to bring our portion of the panel before the questions to a close, we have had a novel technology produce a joke for you about us.
Courtesy of ChatGPT, an art critic, a gallery owner, and an artist walk into a bar. The art critic orders a complex cocktail. The gallery owner asks for a fine wine, and the artist just asks for water. Curious, the bartender asks the artist, "Why just water?" The artist replies, "Well, I'm creating a conceptual piece where the medium is my thirst." The art critic immediately nods and says, "Brilliant, a true reflection of the minimalist movement." The gallery owner smiles and adds, "And so cost-effective. We'll have to feature it in our next Avant-Garde exhibition."
Thank you. If there are questions, yeah.
I'd like to, you were mentioning something very interesting earlier. You were talking about this moment where art was separated from society, and the question was about how do we get art back into society? And I couldn't, of course, I had to compare that with technology, and technologies, but it's in some ways so separated from society at the moment that they their own bubble, that they believe the world should go in direction. But it's sometimes has kind of almost it feels sometimes like a joke, but it could be a reality. And one of the question I was wondering is art, especially art, the technology, a way to bring that back to society? So there's the question that we also ask is why all of this works worth it for everyone? You just for a small amount of people, and how art could bridge this gap between this sort of technology that is self-sustaining, is going in its own directions, back to the needs of society.
There was a lot there. I'm just even wondering where to jump in. Sorry. I mean, you said art is self-sustaining. I want to have a bunch of things I want to say about that. I mean, I'm a big believer in culture and the importance of culture as being the space, and I'll talk about it as space, where we can re-encounter ideas from the past and rethink them and shape them anew for ourselves in this moment, so that something that, a work that meant something in one era can mean something very different to us now. And it can mean something then different again later. And that's actually what's great. It's like, those books don't just mean one thing. They mean constantly changing things across time. And culture and arts do that. I think
there are two different languages. You've got the language of art and the language of technology. I think that's why there's been a disconnect for so many decades, and why the intersection of art and technology has been marginalized by the art world. It's like just two different languages. One is talking about emotions and how I feel. The other one is not. And I thought that perhaps with this intimacy we experience now with technology, with everybody with a supercomputer in their pocket, that this would change. And I found that it hasn't. And because while there is an intimacy, a physical intimacy, people still don't understand anything about this. And while they may have an emotional connection to their social media stream, there's still a complete disconnect between these worlds, I feel.
Well,
but hasn't that always done for me, I feel like that's always been the job of media artists. I mean, it kind of reminds me of like Chris Burney's line of the commercial talk, right? To uncover these kinds of uses and find misusing technology.
That's right.
Taking the novel part of technology and then sort of twisting it.
Well, that plays well. That plays well with the art world. I'm guilty of this myself, subverting technology for the amusement of the elite, the art elite. I'm looking at you. You're art elite. You're art elite. You're all elitists. Sorry. It's a compliment.
Because I hear what you're saying. Supercomputer in the pocket. People don't even make a website anymore.
That's right.
They don't even know it's possible. And there's a whole generation that doesn't know what it's like to grow up without that feed of super.
I mean, we experienced this in this crypto world, and art and crypto and NFTs, and a new cohort of artists who maybe didn't identify as artists 6 months earlier. And the first thing they come out with is that this is a revolution, and it's us against the traditionalists, the institutions, the auction houses, all of that, because it sounded cool and punk rock. But when push comes to shove, and you want to learn more about this new group of artists' work, frequently it can be quite frustrating because they have nothing to say about their work. I'm generalizing, but I'm actually thinking about a group of a few hundred artists.
I agree. I
You
agree
yeah?
with you. I
Good.
agree with you. Yeah.
That's one thing.
Unfortunately.
Yeah, and so, but what's funny is that as this narrative, as I talk about this frequently, and this narrative gets heard over and over again, you're starting to see the engineers trying to game the system. Oh, so I have to talk about how I use this color palette because it's nostalgic and it reminds people of their childhood, and like people catch on very quickly, and this goes back to the engineering of novelty.
Exactly, and this is where exactly I think, faking it is not really only get you as an artist to be an artist, by huge, because you can't constantly fake it. Like you can't fake the
I don't know. I'm maybe with a more critical eye and mind, we might find that a lot of the avant-garde is just fake.
I mean, I think we could look at mainstream contemporary art, not just media art, and be like, there's a whole lot of fakers going on, right? But one of the things that, I just started thinking about there is that it seems as if I wanted to understand technology, and I've written a lot, just like I'm guilty, I've written a lot about how art projects can help us understand some of the technologies and the systems that they are a part of. And I've really believed in that. But if I really want to understand how a technology works, I might more productively go learn how to code or watch a bunch of YouTube videos about the algorithms or that kind of thing, right? Like if that's what I wanted to learn, that's what might be better at doing that. But what it is that art has always done in a meaningful way is provide us a space in which to encounter what it means to be human in whatever situation we're in, whether it's 1530 or 2023, in which case, and I think you were both sort of getting to this, it's like how can these technologies that we are using help bring us into greater awareness of being human in this very hybrid existence that we now have?
Absolutely.
It's a good point, yeah.
Especially in a time when, as artists, I can attest to this, and I even know the audience as an audience as well. We're coming more and more under the influence of technology, eating away at our humanity. And I don't know where that point is, where we can't save ourselves, but for sure, I think we resonate with work that nudges us back towards our humanity. And if we use technology to do that, even better.
Yeah.
Kind of connected with a few things that Raj mentioned when we did this, how it is connected with being human, but also the concept of the avant-garde in the current state of technology is that there has been a debate, especially in theory, in the last couple of years, about the very rapid evolution of technology and how artists are using it. And there's been debated how somehow the feeling is that now artists are kind of running after technology rather than the other way around it used to be. I don't know if this is true, but sometimes
It is true.
Reading from the outside. And it goes back to the concept of the avant-garde. So should the avant-garde be about describing contemporaneity from an artist's perspective? Because most of the time we talk about the avant-garde as being ahead of time. We say, oh, look, future is like this vision that 100 years later is still valid. So,
yeah, you're talking about people scrambling, one, to be relevant, and perhaps avant-garde is pre-relevance.
I mean, now that
reveals itself over time.
Now that there's a job called being a futurist, right? It's question. I mean, it seems weird to me that there's this push to be able to imagine the future when I find I right now need to spend so much time just understanding being now. Like I find myself thinking a lot about present tense.
When you say now, do you mean
Now, or when you said no?
All of the nows.
Okay.
Maybe in the last year, I've been thinking about this notion of presence, right, and being present tense, and not thinking about what's about to come, but actually where and how difficult it is to be present tense now.
Is tomorrow also now?
We have no idea.
Okay.
Fingers crossed we'll be here.
Okay.
In the back, yeah.
Yes, so maybe I think which just sparks this question. This has been in the era of vanity. At time in which we think about the future the most, both as a society, but both also as people in the art world. And when your mental capacity is so far stretched out into the future, and you understand like what she is aesthetically, but that future says about what's gonna come, I think it's so hard to also define that one, because you have a tendency to maybe place anything that comes into your view as something that could belong to now. So it's very hard for something to be belonging to the front way when you can very much understand it's just the teleological way to what's gonna come. It belongs to now. So I think with that sense, like we are right now thinking so much in terms of like long-termism, these effective altruists are coming in and trying to plot our course into it. So I have a hard time when I encounter any work of art or an artist's vision to ever place it as a art as yourself, maybe, because then I find that this tendency to consider any, this is just these stepping stones into the future, but not avant-garde. So like that sort of distinction eroding me. How would you make sense of that like problem that's that comes with thinking about the future? So it becomes part.
I have never heard so many references to effective altruism since I've been in Istanbul. What's going on? Like the only time I heard it before was when Sam Bankman-Fried was arrested. But like, why is everybody here talking about effective altruism? Have you noticed
Change
this?
is coming.
Accelerationism and effective altruism.
Yeah.
I knew in Paris that nobody talks to me about effective altruism, but here, every other person. What's going on? No reason.
It's an interesting thing, though, and maybe it speaks to why is it that would be particularly important here now? Might be a present
Keeps
tense.
coming up.
Yeah. Challenging question. We'll come back to that. Are there any others before we wrap up? Because I'm realizing we should. Can I let someone else, since you already asked? Yeah, go ahead.
Hey, I was thinking about Kate's comment about artists being mixed as the best film festival, and whether that it makes us artists or innovators, and whether we want to be innovators. So I'm wondering, is maybe the avant-garde that we're talking about has been corrupted by profit somehow, and that's
Totally.
Yeah, completely.
Creativity totally killed by money.
it is still creativity. What do we call creativity? Is how the creative is part of the job of the corporation. But these people are not artists. They just have their call also.
I heard Impressionism came out of greedy paint companies who just wanted the artist to put more paint on the canvas. That's what I've heard. It's always been there. Yeah, exactly. The tube manufacturers.
And the irony is, of course, that especially the what I'm generalizing as the Russian avant-garde, right, very much believed in those artists were commercial practitioners. It was very important to them that they were doing that. That was a part of the avant-garde they were talking about, was bringing art into social, economic, political life, right?
Yeah, but not for the commercial use, for more propaganda in terms of political, social.
No, but they were also doing it for economic use. I mean, they were making ads, and they were doing, they saw it as, and so it's interesting to recognize that in that moment, that was a significant step. And now that same activity reads differently, right?
So we should keep subverting and misusing. Is that a role? Because we're actually giving them the answers they're looking for.
I think it's only the questions to oneself by looking at yourself in the mirror. What are your values and what are your principles? If you really would like to commodify yourself in a certain way, and what is the most important to you as a human being. I think it's a challenge that everybody has to face, not only the artist. Yes?
That seems like a good note to end on, I have to say. Thank you, Kate. Thank you, everyone, for joining us and for this conversation. Hopefully we can keep having it. And I think we're the last talk for today, but there are 2 more tomorrow. So
No, there is one,
one
very
more?
interesting one with at 3:30.
Let's look at 3:30.
Okay, good.
Art inventors.
Oh, excellent. Okay, my apologies. There's so much going on at Noise. There's so much noise being made. It's hard to keep up. So there's another talk at 3:30. All the more reason for us to take a break now. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.